It was one of those mornings when the world feels fresh and full of promise, the kind of spring day where sunlight spills generously across every surface, making even the busiest places seem alive with possibility. The air at Heathrow Airport carried that familiar mix of scents: freshly brewed coffee from the nearby cafe, the faint tang of jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac, and the perfume of hurried travelers brushing past. People moved with purpose, wheeling suitcases, juggling passports, and scanning departure boards, as if the whole world could change with the next announcement. There was a subtle hum beneath it all, a blend of rolling suitcase wheels, soft conversations in dozens of languages, and the distant roar of planes lifting into the sky. From where I stood, it wasn't just an airport, it was a crossroads of countless stories. Each person around me carried a different destination in their mind, a different reason for being here, some meeting family after years apart, others chasing opportunities, and a few simply seeking the unknown. The sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, catching on polished floors and reflecting onto the faces of strangers who, for a brief moment, shared this space and time before scattering across the globe. My own journey was about to begin, but I lingered in the moment, taking in the details as though they were pieces of a puzzle I didn't yet understand. A flight attendant passed by, her smile perfectly practiced yet warm enough to make you believe it was meant just for you. A group of students clustered near the gate, chattering excitedly and snapping photos, their backpacks full of guidebooks and dreams. Across from me, a businessman tapped quickly at his laptop, oblivious to the shifting scene around him, focused only on the glowing screen that tethered him to somewhere else. Announcements echoed above, each one carrying a little ripple of change as people stood, gathered their things, and moved toward their gates. My own flight was still some time away, but already I could feel the pull of Istanbul, a city I had never seen, yet one that seemed to call from far beyond the airport walls. There was something about that name that stirred the imagination. Narrow streets and bustling markets, the scent of spices, the mingling of ancient history and modern life. The sunlight outside caught on the sleek silver body of a plane being prepared for departure, luggage carts weaving around it like ants at work. Somewhere in the distance, the soft rumble of engines grew, then faded again, like the heartbeat of the airport itself. A young family walked past me, the father balancing a sleeping toddler against his shoulder, while the mother tried to keep hold of an energetic little boy who was determined to explore everything in sight. They were laughing despite the chaos, and I couldn't help but smile at their unspoken understanding. Travel was rarely perfect, but it was always worth it. Time at an airport has a strange rhythm. Minutes stretch long when you're waiting, yet somehow the day itself slips by quickly. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting its warmth match the growing anticipation in my chest. The thought of boarding, of settling into my seat and feeling the ground slip away beneath me, sent a small thrill through my stomach. Travel, after all, is more than the destination. It's the transformation that happens somewhere between here and there. As I glanced around one last time before heading toward my gate, I felt an odd sense of connection to everyone around me. We were all in motion, all part of this great shifting tide of human movement, and though our paths would soon diverge, for now, we were united by the same bright morning, the same sense of setting out towards something new. The journey had already begun long before the plane's wheels would ever leave the ground. There's a certain energy that builds in those final moments before boarding, a mix of excitement, restlessness, and the quiet hum of possibility. Standing at the gate, the glass wall before me framed the aircraft like a promise waiting to be kept. It stood there patiently, the long, sleek body gleaming under the soft April sunlight, ready to carry 100 different stories across the skies. Around me, people shuffled in small steps toward the boarding queue, their faces a reflection of every possible emotion, eager smiles, tired eyes, focused expressions, and the occasional absent-minded stare that revealed someone's mind was already halfway to their destination. In those moments, the atmosphere thickens with a sense of departure. The routine voices of the gate staff calling boarding groups somehow feel personal, as if they are speaking directly to each individual's reason for travel. My heart quickened slightly when my group was announced. It wasn't fear, though I've never entirely lost that awareness of the unknown. It was more like stepping into a moment you've imagined for days, weeks, maybe even months. Istanbul was no longer just a name printed on my ticket. It was about to become a real place beneath my feet. The line moved forward, and I found myself clutching my boarding pass just a little tighter. Ahead, a young couple leaned into each other, speaking in low voices and exchanging smiles that seemed to hold an entire world of shared plans. Just behind me, an older gentleman adjusted the strap of his worn leather bag, his eyes darting toward the boarding bridge with the impatience of someone who's made this journey many times, but still feels the pull of what lies ahead. The air around us was filled with a quiet rustle, zippers opening, passports sliding from pockets, boarding passes being scanned with that soft, affirming beep. Walking down the jet bridge, there's always that shift in sensation. The temperature drops slightly, the air smells faintly metallic, and the muffled roar of the engines begins to seep into your awareness. The light from the terminal windows fades, replaced by the soft glow from the aircraft's doorway. As I stepped inside, the cabin crew welcomed me with those practiced yet warm greetings that mark the start of every flight, and for a moment I felt as though I'd crossed into another world entirely. Finding my seat was like claiming a small territory in the sky, my own space for the next few hours, where I could watch the world change beneath me. The hum of conversations, the thud of luggage being stowed, and the occasional chuckle from strangers sharing a moment made the cabin feel alive, as if everyone was quietly aware that we were about to share something rare. The act of rising above everything familiar and crossing invisible borders in the clouds. As I settled in, the thought of Istanbul stirred something deep within me. I pictured the skyline I'd only ever seen in photographs, the domes and minarets etched against a golden sunset, the narrow streets winding through markets rich with colors and scents. I imagined the call to prayer drifting over rooftops, the sea shimmering in the distance, and the way the city must feel in the soft light of spring. Soon, these wouldn't just be images in my mind, they would be the backdrop to my own footsteps, my own discoveries. The flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, checking belts and overhead bins, their calm efficiency a steadying presence. Outside my window, the runway stretched wide and empty, waiting. The engines began to build their steady, reassuring vibration, a reminder that soon the ground would release its hold. My fingers rested on the armrest, and for a moment I closed my eyes to feel the energy of the moment fully, the anticipation humming through me, the awareness that every flight is both an ending and a beginning. When the doors closed and the captain's voice came over the speakers, there was a collective stillness in the cabin, as if we had all agreed to hold our breath until the moment of lift-off. I glanced out once more, catching a final glimpse of the terminal and the bright sky beyond, and felt that surge of emotion that comes with knowing you are exactly where you need to be, poised between the life you've known and the journey that's about to unfold. The moment the plane's wheels touched down, it was as if the air itself had changed. Through the small oval window, I caught my first glimpse of Istanbul rooftops clustered tightly together, some tiled in warm reds, others shimmering in the pale spring sunlight. The sky was a soft blue, the kind that seems to hold the promise of gentle breezes and golden afternoons. As we taxied toward the terminal, the sight of the city stretched beyond the airport's edge, a blend of modern glass towers and centuries, old silhouettes that stood like quiet witnesses to history. Stepping into the terminal, the hum of the airport here felt different from the one I'd left behind in London. There was a warmth to the noise, an undercurrent of rhythm in the way people moved and spoke. Snatches of conversation in Turkish floated through the air, rich and flowing, punctuated by the deeper tones of luggage wheels clicking over tiles, and the occasional call of an announcement in both languages. The scent was subtle but distinct coffee roasted dark and strong, mingling with the faint aroma of fresh bread drifting from a cafe tucked along the concourse. Outside, the city greeted me with a rush of color and motion. Taxis in shades of bright yellow zipped past with an almost playful urgency. Street vendors balanced trays of sesame-covered simit, their calls blending into the rising hum of traffic. Above it all, the seagulls circled lazily against the sky, their cries sharp yet somehow fitting in this city that straddles both land and sea. The streets were alive, each corner offering something new, a flash of patterned fabrics hung in shop fronts, the gleam of brass coffee pots stacked in windows, the sparkle of glass lanterns catching the light like captured pieces of sunset. As I moved deeper into the city, the sounds shifted. In one moment, I found myself surrounded by the steady beat of footsteps over cobblestones, the low murmur of shopkeepers chatting across narrow streets. In the next, I was standing in a bustling market, where the air buzzed with haggling voices and the laughter of children weaving between stalls. The spices were impossible to ignore: deep reds of paprika, golden turmeric, and fragrant heaps of dried mint. The smell seemed to wrap itself around me, both grounding and exhilarating, as if every breath was pulling me further into the rhythm of the place. There was a contrast here that fascinated me. Around one corner, a sleek tram slid quietly along its tracks, its polished windows reflecting the soft pastel buildings. Around the next, I was stepping into a shaded courtyard where time seemed to slow, the air cool and still, and the sound of a distant fountain mingled with the faint call to prayer drifting from a nearby mosque. The domes and minarets rose above the city like steady anchors in a sea of movement, their outlines sharp against the sky, yet softened by the light. The Bosphorus shimmered in the distance, its surface catching the sunlight like a scatter of silver coins. Standing by the water, I could hear the gentle lap of waves against the stone, the deep blast of a ferry horn, and the faint clink of tea glasses from a cafe perched nearby. On the opposite shore, the city continued, layered and endless, a reminder that Istanbul was not just a destination, but a living, breathing bridge between worlds. Everywhere I turned, there was a collision of textures and tones, the cool touch of marble steps worn smooth by countless feet, the warm, rough grain of wooden doors carved generations ago, the burst of fresh greenery from trees just beginning to dress themselves for spring. It was impossible to separate the sights from the sounds from the scents. They all wove together into something richer, something that could only be understood by being here, by letting it wash over you. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the city's colors shifted once again. The domes glowed softly in the fading light, the water deepened into a darker shade of blue, and the lamps along the streets flickered to life, casting pools of gold across the pavement. The air cooled, the energy softened, but the life of the city never truly slowed. And in that moment, I knew that every detail, every sight, every sound, every contrast was not just something to observe, but something to carry forward long after the journey itself would end. It often happens when you least expect it. You set out with a plan, a map, perhaps even a schedule, and then something or someone steps quietly into your path and changes everything. That's how it began for me in the narrow lanes just beyond the bustle of the Grand Bazaar. I had been walking without hurry, letting the streets guide me rather than my itinerary, when a sudden downpour caught everyone by surprise. The rain came hard and fast, drumming against the cobblestones, sending shopkeepers hurrying to pull awnings over their goods. I ducked under the nearest shelter, a small doorway framed by faded blue paint, where an elderly man was already standing, leaning lightly on a cane. He glanced at me, his eyes bright beneath thick brows, and without a word, stepped back to make room. The rain roared so loudly we had to raise our voices to be heard, and in those few minutes an unexpected conversation began. His English was careful, but his warmth needed no translation. He told me in brief, vivid bursts of the street we stood on, how it had been in his youth, the families who had lived here, the way the market once filled with voices from dawn to dusk. When the rain eased, he pointed me toward a cafe tucked down a side alley, insisting I try their tea before I left the neighborhood. I might never have found it otherwise, and later, sitting with a steaming glass in hand, I realized I had been given more than a drink suggestion. I had been invited, however briefly, into a piece of someone's life. Not long after, in a small art gallery near the waterfront, I found myself drawn to a painting of the Bosphorus at sunrise. The artist was there, arranging a row of canvases, and when I asked about the piece, her eyes lit up. She spoke about the morning she painted it, the quiet mist that hung low over the water, the way the colors shifted before the city woke. We ended up walking outside together, where she pointed out the very spot she had stood that day. Her voice carried the kind of affection that only comes from a lifelong relationship with a place, and it made me see the water differently, not just as a beautiful view, but as something that breathed with the rhythm of the city itself. Another day, while weaving through the spice bazaar, I felt a tap on my shoulder. A boy of perhaps 10 stood there, grinning, holding out a small packet of saffron. He didn't speak English, and I didn't know enough Turkish, but somehow, through a flurry of gestures and shared laughter, he convinced me to follow him. We wound through a maze of stalls until he stopped at one where a woman, his mother, stood behind a counter piled high with fragrant spices. She poured me a small cup of something warm and sweet, and even without words, there was a connection in the exchange. They didn't ask for anything, they simply shared what they had. I left with the saffron and a feeling that lingered longer than the taste of the tea. These encounters weren't part of any guidebook or plan. They happened in the in-between moments, when I allowed myself to pause instead of rush, to listen instead of just look. Each one shifted my understanding of the city, making it less of a destination and more of a living, breathing presence, filled with people whose lives briefly brushed against mine. And that, I think, is the quiet magic of travel, the way it gifts you these moments, unscheduled and unrepeatable, yet somehow exactly what you were meant to find. It's strange how mystery has a way of slipping quietly into a journey, revealing itself in moments so small that you almost miss their weight until later. One afternoon in Istanbul, I found myself wandering along a quiet street in the old quarter, far from the tourist routes. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the only sounds were the muffled thud of footsteps and the occasional creak of wooden shutters swinging in the breeze. I had no real destination in mind, just a curiosity that kept pushing me to see what was around the next corner. That was when I noticed a narrow doorway set into the side of a faded stone building. It was slightly ajar, and through the gap came the faintest trace of music, not the loud, bustling kind, but something soft, almost secret, like a melody played for an audience of one. I hesitated, unsure if I should step closer, but something about that sound pulled me forward. Inside, the light was dim, and the walls were lined with shelves stacked high with books in Turkish, English, and languages I couldn't name. At the back, an older woman sat at a wooden desk, a small record player spinning beside her. She looked up and smiled, as if she'd been expecting me. We spoke briefly, and she explained that the shop had been in her family for generations. Her grandfather had opened it as a bookshop, but it had always doubled as a place for music and quiet conversation. Before I left, she pressed a small, handwritten card into my hand, an address and a time. "Come tonight," she said, "if you want to hear the full story." I walked away with my mind full of questions, not entirely sure if I'd go, but unable to shake the curiosity her words had planted. That evening, under a sky streaked with violet and gold, I found myself at the address she had given me. It was a modest townhouse, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening street. Inside, a small gathering was in progress, no more than 10 people, seated in a circle, each holding a glass of tea. The woman from the shop welcomed me in, and soon the room filled with stories. They were not rehearsed tales or tourist attractions, but personal accounts of the city love found in crowded trams, fortunes made and lost in the markets, moments of quiet bravery during difficult times. Some were spoken in Turkish and translated, others told in English, but all carried that same thread of intimacy and trust. Another time, I was crossing Galata Bridge just as the sun began to sink behind the hills. Fishermen lined the railings, their lines swaying gently in the breeze. One of them, a man with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to hold the whole sky, called me over. Without a word, he handed me his fishing rod. I didn't catch anything, but he laughed softly, shaking his head as though the point had never been about the fish. Before I left, he pressed something small into my palm, a silver coin, worn smooth with age. He said only that it had been his father's, and that I should keep it for luck. Why he chose to give it to me, I'll never know, and perhaps that's the beauty of it. Not all surprises came wrapped in kindness. Some arrived as puzzles I couldn't quite solve. One morning, while exploring the twisting streets near the Spice Bazaar, I passed a small, unmarked door. A man stepped out, nodded to me, and quickly disappeared into the crowd. Out of instinct, I glanced inside and caught sight of a single candle burning in an otherwise empty room. There was no explanation, no sign, no clue to what it meant, and though I thought about asking someone, I decided to leave it as it was a small mystery that belonged to the city and not to me. Travel, I've learned, is never just about what you plan to see. It's about the things you stumble upon the half, heard music behind a door, the gatherings you never expected to join, the strangers who leave you with objects or words you'll carry long after you've gone. These are the moments that stay with you, not because they give answers, but because they leave you with questions worth remembering. From the very first day in Istanbul, the city became my classroom, and every street corner seemed to offer a lesson I hadn't planned for. The language was everywhere written in bold, looping script on shop signs, whispered between friends on cafe terraces, sung out in the melodic calls of vendors. At first, I caught only fragments, single words I recognized from guidebooks or language apps, but hearing them in the flow of real life made them feel alive in a way no textbook ever could. Ordering tea became more than just a daily ritual. It was a chance to try the words I'd been practicing quietly in my head. The first time I said "Burke Lutfen." To a waiter, the words stumbled out awkwardly, but his smile was warm, and he repeated them back with the right rhythm, as if gifting me the melody I'd been missing. With each attempt, my ear grew sharper. I began to notice how the same phrase shifted slightly depending on the tone, the company, or even the time of day. Conversations unfolded in layers, and even when I couldn't follow every word, I listened for patterns, the rise and fall of sentences, the way laughter or a sigh filled the spaces between. In the markets, bargaining wasn't just about prices. It was an exchange of language and culture, a dance of words and gestures. Sometimes I got it wrong and was met with a good-natured chuckle. Other times I surprised myself by being understood perfectly. Each small victory felt like unlocking a door to a deeper connection. One afternoon, while sitting in a small park near the water, I struck up a conversation with a university student who was eager to practice his English. We traded languages, teaching each other phrases, correcting each other's mistakes, laughing when our accents turned a word into something completely different. He showed me how to say simple sentences I could use on my walks, and in return, I helped him with expressions he'd only read in books but never heard in real conversation. By the time we parted, I realized I'd learned more in that single exchange than in weeks of study at home. Even signs and menus became quiet teachers. I would pause at tram stations, reading every word on the schedule, sounding out each syllable under my breath. In bakeries, I'd point to unfamiliar pastries and ask for their names, repeating them softly as I carried them away, letting the taste and the word fuse into one memory. It wasn't about memorizing lists of vocabulary. It was about weaving those words into moments I would never forget. The rhythm of the city made learning effortless. The calls of the ferry captains, the announcements on the tram, the chatter spilling from open shop doors, all of it formed a background track that I began to understand without even realizing it. Sometimes I'd catch a phrase I'd learned days before and feel a small surge of pride, like recognizing the face of an old friend in a crowd. There was one evening in particular when I felt the shift most clearly. I had wandered into a small family-run restaurant, the kind with mismatched chairs and walls covered in framed photographs. The owner came to take my order, and instead of relying on pointing or English, I spoke in simple Turkish, not perfect, but enough to ask about the dish of the day, to say I'd like to try it, and to thank him warmly. His expression changed just slightly from polite service to genuine welcome. In that moment, I wasn't just a visitor passing through. I was someone making the effort to belong, even if only for a short while. Learning the language in this way was never about studying for the sake of study. It was about opening myself to the world around me, letting it teach me naturally, without walls or desks. It was about understanding that every word I learned carried not just meaning, but the voice, the face, and the memory of the person who shared it with me. And by the time the journey drew to a close, I knew I wasn't leaving Istanbul with just photographs and souvenirs. I was carrying a piece of its voice inside my own. And so, as the journey comes to its gentle close, the bustling mornings, the soaring anticipation, the vivid streets, the unexpected encounters, the quiet mysteries, and the shared words all weave into one story. Each moment has left its mark, shaping not just a trip, but a part of who I am. Istanbul may fade from sight, but its spirit will travel with me always.